Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Watson. I have the title of Distinguished Professor of History and Avron Fogelman Research Professor at Lynn University. It's a small liberal arts private school in South Florida. And I've had the great pleasure of doing a number of programs with CuriosityStream. Today, we're talking about the first American pandemic. From time to time, there are these paradigm shifts. Events that seem to change society in countless ways. I guess you could look back at Galileo or Copernicus when they turned their telescope to the heavens and they noticed that the universe was not geocentric with the Earth as the centerpiece, but heliocentric. We were one of just many planets moving around a sun, which was one of many suns revolving around the Milky Way galaxy and so on. And that humbled humanity. It changed our perception of ourselves, our religion, our science. So it marked a fundamental transformation in society. Perhaps Columbus or Darwin, Columbus bumping into or discovering entire new land masses, ultimately two continents with long and rich civilizations there. That changed everything. Darwin, on his voyage to the Galapagos and the Beagle, realized that the origins of humanity were a bit different than the biblical notions, natural selection and evolutionary theory, that we came from animals. That was a humbling experience and a transformational experience for society. Again, religion, our values, our politics, and so on. Then, of course, Sigmund Freud, I guess you could say, his work would mark another paradigm shift when not only are we an animal, but we're a fundamentally sick one who we're not in control consciously of our actions, that these come from the recesses of our subconscious, unconscious, and so forth. I guess you could maybe look at Carl Sagan's work, that one day we'll find life elsewhere in the cosmos, and that will be a paradigm shift that'll change our science and values and our perspective on ourselves and the things around us. Maybe one day when men discover that women are people too and are equal, if not superior, that I think will be a paradigm shift. But I would say for our times, I asked my students what were the first major events in their life that they really remember, or what events really changed them. When you talk to adults, somebody might say Kennedy's assassination or the Vietnam War or things of that effect. People might remember the Challenger blowing up, 9/11. But really, COVID-19, I think, has been a paradigm shift. Think about it, everybody. It's not just the death toll and the cost to society, but the upheaval in terms of business practices. I don't know about you, but I have trouble dressing up anymore. I'm used to sitting here doing things like this in shorts. New technologies like Zoom that make programs like this possible. All this was a transformation from the big issues like a global supply chain backlog to seemingly small issues which actually add up. People missing birthdays and bar mitzvahs and weddings and graduations. I had students on campus that missed sporting events, teams that made the postseason, and all of a sudden it came to an end because of COVID. It's disrupted society in ways that we're still not recovering from. But I think the biggest upheaval was probably our politics, its impact on society and the deep political divisions that were already apparent, but just deepened through COVID. So with all that, COVID got me thinking. I had a lot of free time, as we all did, sitting at home doing all my research online rather than visiting the National Archives or the Library of Congress or wherever I would go. It started me thinking about other examples of disease and pandemics in American history. But I didn't want to, and I ultimately wrote a book about it. I didn't want to write about the Spanish influenza because I thought that was reasonably well known and reasonably well documented. So I tried to figure out what was the first major pandemic. In fact, it was called a plague at the time in American history. And that would be a yellow fever pandemic that struck Philadelphia in the year 1793. Now, this was important for several reasons. Philadelphia was the interim capital at the time. The Revolutionary War began in 1775. It would end in 1783. And when the war began, we did not have a permanent seat of government. We didn't even have a constitution. It would take us several years before we'd agree to the Articles of Confederation, which were wholly ineffectual. And then not until 1787 would we put a constitution down. Not till 1789 would we ratify it. We would not open up the city that is now Washington, D.C., our permanent seat of government, until November 1, 1800. So that's not a way to start a new nation and not even have a capital. But in this vigorous, heated debate over where the capital should be, George Washington even wrote that of all the debates during the Constitutional Convention, and think about the debates over slavery and what would become the Electoral College and limiting government's powers, the ugly 3/5 clause, which the South pretty much insisted on. Otherwise, they were going to walk out of it. Of all the debates, George Washington said, the one that was the most heated was, where do we put the capital city? So amidst that horrendous debate, they went to New York City. And that's where George Washington was inaugurated in late April of 1789. But New York City would just be an interim capital. There was a deal cut between Hamilton and Jefferson, with Madison in attendance. And if you watch the musical Hamilton, that's the room where it happened. And I did a program on that here for One Day University. But the deal was that they would eventually put the capital on the shores of the Potomac River, where it is today, after a 10-year period. But for 9 years then, after leaving New York City, it would be in Philadelphia. So this heated debate, they moved the capital to Philadelphia, and we weren't out of the woods. There was still an argument that we should stay in Philadelphia, an argument that maybe go back to New York City. The South wanted to make sure we went to Virginia, maybe even Charleston, maybe even Williamsburg, maybe even. So amidst that debate, we have this yellow fever pandemic. Also, it was really the first crisis, the first test of this fledgling republic, this nascent government. And my goodness, what a test it would be. It was a pandemic that was described as a plague, which would spread up and down the eastern seaboard, claiming lots and lots of lives. Ultimately, at least 10% of the capital city of Philadelphia, at least 10% of the population died, perhaps much higher because of record keeping at the time. So there was finger pointing. Sadly, fear replaced fact. Paranoia replaced civility. And the blame game started. Blaming, denying there was a pandemic, denying it was real, it was a hoax, it was fake. Sound familiar? And it really deepened the divisions in society. That we had the nascent political factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. This would help to ensconce them as full political parties, because each side, each party, each faction took a different position on this. So it was a horrific test in Philadelphia, made all the worse by the fact that we had the primitive state of medicine at the time and science. No one knew where this disease, this pandemic, this plague, as it was described, came from, and there was no known cure for it. So amidst that, it was just a horrific situation. This is a quote from Matthew Carey. He was perhaps the city's most noted newspaperman, and you can read it. And what he's basically saying is, nobody went outside without a handkerchief or a sponge or a mask covering their face. They put vinegar in the end of this bird's beak mask and a cloth, thinking the vinegar would kill the disease. People were burning pieces of tarred rope, lighting fires, thinking the smoke would get rid of it. They wore camphor bags around their neck with various herbs and poisons and toxics and plants and all sorts of things. People would avoid, if they saw a black horse-drawn hearse coming, people who had lost a loved one or family member to this disease, those people were shunned. People avoided, they were told to walk on opposite sides of the street, one way, for this way, another side of the street for that way. People avoided all that together. They didn't want to be near houses. Houses were marked. People were chanting, "Bring out your dead." They were loading up the dead in wagons. People took to the middle of the streets. Just horrendous. Here's the quote by Matthew Carey in 1793, the newspaperman. Shaking hands ended. Relationships ended. And of course, then we get down to the interesting one. Some people refused to wear masks. They claimed it was a violation of their freedom. Others deemed that the plague, the pandemic, was not real. Political leaders denied it. Some political leaders and newspapers pointed fingers, and the blame game really went on. And all through this, anger prevailed. So that's what really got me interested in this topic. And our story starts in the winter and spring of 1792 with a really bizarre event. It was an idealistic, well-intentioned event, but ultimately foolish and degrading as can be. And that would be what was known as the Bulama experiment, so named for a small island off Bissau, Guinea-Bissau's coast in West Africa. And what it was a group of well-intentioned abolitionists, a lot of them deeply religious Christians in England. And they, inspired by William Wilberforce and the movement to end the transatlantic slave trade, they had an idea. And the idea went something like this. They were going to buy land, as you can read. This is their quote in their manifesto, if you will. They were going to buy land. They were going to buy an island on the west coast of Africa. And they were going to go down and they were going to teach the savages, as they said, to read, to write, to wear clothing, and Christianize them. They were going to teach them to be civilized, quote unquote, to be industrious and put their labor to positive use. Having done that, that would be a demonstration that Africans were not inferior and were capable of being civilized. So there's the degrading colonial mindset. Now, if they succeed in doing that, that they thought would be a knockout blow to slavery. Look, we can civilize folks, so let's end slavery. So this is their argument, the Bulama experiment. What the founders of it, there were 6 folks who met in pubs in London. They created the Bulama Association. By the way, the island there I marked on the map, you can just see off the west coast of Guinea-Bissau, which is in Western Africa. It's sometimes spelled with an O, sometimes spelled with a U. It's just various spellings for Bulama. So the Bulama Association, they took investors and they invited people, colonists, to join them. They ultimately bought 3 ships and they would sail to Bulama and to begin the experiment to teach Africans to wear clothing, to read, to write, to be civilized, and of course, to Christianize them. So that was the association. They set sail. You can see on April 11th of 1792, there were 3 ships, the Calypso, the Beggar's Benson, and the main one, their flagship, if you will, was the Henke. That's an image of it on the right. The Henke was a sturdy ocean-going ship. You can see multiple masts, multiple hulls. They loaded it with chickens and goats and pigs and supplies, lots of Bibles, lots of extra clothing, and they set sail. Ultimately, this ship would be patient zero, ground zero for an international plague of spreading the yellow fever, spreading this pandemic all across the globe. It would come from this one ship. So they set sail for Africa, and everything went wrong, starting with the planning. So they invited 3 shiploads, basically, of pilgrim-like Christians. What they did not bring were enough carpenters, farmers, soldiers, people that could actually build a settlement and run a settlement and protect them. They also hired a captain for this ship, the Henke, who had never captained a ship on the ocean. He ultimately gets the ship lost several times. The 3 ships run aground. All sorts of things happen. Omens from the very beginning. As they're ready to set sail, some disease, some malady, a pestilence tore through the ship, killing several people that they threw overboard. Some abandoned the ships right away. So at any rate, the ship set sail. Amazingly, they found their way to Bulama. After delays, they found their way there in the summer of 1792. Now, they were warned not to go to Bulama or to Bissau. Here's a quote I put on the screen. "Beware and take care of the bite of Benin. For the one that comes out, there are 40 that go in." That was a sailor's warning. And these colonists were warned that there's cannibals, there's savages, there's violent tribes all along the area, and to not go there. Moreover, there are Portuguese pirates, basically, that are going to hit an English ship, especially 3 ships that are small and don't have enough artillery and sailors and soldiers on board. So on the left, that's an image of the coastline. That probably is what it looked like when they arrived at one of these 88 small islands. Balama's only 25 miles square. So one of the mistakes they made, they picked the wrong place. Obviously, it's too small for agriculture, really. And also, they arrived in the wet season. On the right is an image of what it looks like today. Tragically, it's a very recessed collection of islands that have become basically narco islands. You can see the streets aren't even paved and so on. So the colonists finally arrive, and after weeks and weeks at sea and death on board and everything that went wrong, cramped hulls of the ships, everyone was sick. The smell of it, the rough seas, they finally arrived on the island, and it was about to get a lot worse. So there were three arrivals. The settlers arrived, and you can see from the image on the lower right, that's Captain Philip Beaver. He was not the naval captain of the ship. He was the captain that oversaw the entire expedition, this Balama experiment. And he would be a fanatical dictator. And as things got worse, he became more dictatorial. Not only did the settlers arrive, but the local people arrived, the Cannibacks. And it turns out that they were cannibals. One of the leaders of the expedition, when he saw them, his name was Joshua Montefiore, and I put his quote there. You can see the colonial racist description. Canoes of armed Indians, this is the first they see the Cannibacks, possessing very disagreeable features, their lips being exceedingly thick and their noses remarkably broad and flat. Their complexion was of a coal black, and they had no clothing except a small leather apron. They were aghast. But what the settlers did, the colonists did, is they took their livestock, supplies, everything ashore to start building farms and stockades and so on. And then Joshua Montefiore, he walked out under a flag of truce, a white flag, which of course had no cultural meaning whatsoever to the Cannibacks. They didn't speak the language. Of course, the settlers didn't bring warm weather clothing. They had no experience with tropical climates. Montefiore goes to meet them, and they grab him and they put him up against a rock and they hack his arm off in front of the settlers. The settlers that were ashore run for the boat, the three boats. The Cannibacks attack. They start hacking people apart on the beaches. They catch the women and children, and they strip them and they take them back to their canoes and leave. So it's a scene of death and destruction on the beaches. Later, a few of the settlers with guns go ashore and they find bones around the area. So they think that the idea of Cannibacks being cannibals is true. They flee back to the three ships and stay aboard the ships. The next day, they go ashore to look for any survivors or the women and children that were confiscated. And they find that all their livestock was killed and taken away to be eaten, and their supplies, tools, everything's taken. Of course, the rainy season sets in. They're stuck on board the boats that they were stuck on for weeks. And then disease arrives, and that's the worst of the arrivals. One of the settlers wrote that they called themselves Canniback chickens, that the Cannibacks just arrive and harvest them whenever they want to eat someone. But the disease would claim more people than the Cannibacks. The settlers made it worse by the fact that they didn't have the chance to plant. It was the rainy season, which spreads mosquitoes and disease. It was hot and humid. They went deep into the forests and they shot some monkeys to eat, and those monkeys were infected with the disease, thus bringing everything back to them. Things get worse and worse to the point where about half of the settlers are now dead within a few months. So two of the ships, the Calypso and the Beggar's Benson, they leave and they head back to England. Philip Beaver, the captain in charge, is so dictatorial. He forbids anybody else from leaving and says, we're going to make a go of this. They're stuck on the ships. When they go ashore, they're killed. People are dying by the day in disease. And that's the state of it. Ultimately, they agree to leave. And they do so in the winter of 1793. Now, they're going to sail back to England. As they're sailing back, they meet two British warships who say you can't do it. The French, the Portuguese, the Spanish are marauding along with pirates all along, the entrance to the Mediterranean. And your small ship without sailors, soldiers, and enough artillery, you'll be blown out of the water. So the only option for them is either A, go back to Balama, which was not an option, or B, sail to the Caribbean, West Indies. So they set sail all across the West Indies. Unfortunately, there was a stowaway aboard the Henke, and it was the disease-carrying mosquito, Aedes aegypti, known as the unwelcome Egyptian. The ship first docks in Barbados, and just a few days after docking in Barbados, people start falling sick and dying in boatloads. The ship is forced out of the harbor at Barbados, so it sails to another British possession, St. Vincent. Same thing happens. A few days later, people are dying wholesale, and the ship is kicked out of St. Vincent. It sails to Grenada. When it arrives in Grenada, the disease really strikes. Now, Grenada was a prominent British possession. Today, it's known as the Spice Island. A lot of spices and herbs from worldwide are grown there. And the British had a large fort up on a hill, commanding a majestic view of the sea, a good defensive position, Fort George. Inside the fort, 20 soldiers a day on average are dying. They run out of lime for the burials. They're just finally digging mass pits, and virtually every European on the island is dying. Some of the locals are dying as well. The British know that the island, and therefore a lot of the Caribbean, West Indies possessions, are vulnerable to attacks from the French, Spanish, or pirates. So they sail with 700 reinforcements to man Fort George. The reinforcements arrive. One of them, as you can see on my quote here, Lieutenant Thomas Howard. Of the 700 reinforcements, only 200 lived. 500 died. Thomas Howard said, "It is impossible for words to express the horror that presented itself at this time. Thus was the disease." So the Henke becomes patient zero, the ghost ship. Now, on nearby islands, as I indicated on top of the screen, Antigua, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Kitts, Trinidad, boats that docked near the Henke set sail for those islands. Mosquitoes must have found their way on board those boats, so they were unknowingly carrying the disease with them, and it starts wiping out. So the whole West Indies is affected. So kicked out of Grenada, the Henke sails to Saint Domingue, which is today Haiti. And it arrives in Haiti, and it arrives as the main port. And from the sea, they can see that the main port city is on fire. It's being burned. There's a revolution in Haiti at Saint Domingue. It had about the largest population of slaves. It became the crown jewel for France. Its production of molasses, rum, sugar, and other things were supplying a good deal of the world. It was making France a lot of money. But the colonial plantation owners were just brutal. So as atrocious as the colonial plantation owners were, the payback was just as atrocious. People were hacked limb from limb in the streets. So it was a brutal revolution. So the Henke arrives at the port, and the captain of the ship and Philip Beaver realize that they could make a little money. Whites are desperate to flee the island. So what they do is they sell seats on board the Henke, and the wealthiest that still had money left come on board the ship. While they were docked doing this, the mosquito gets off the ship, of course. It's the rainy season, it's a tropical island, and it spreads. At the top, you see an image of Toussaint Louverture, the great French general, African former slave and general, and leader of the revolution. The French send tens of thousands of soldiers to put down the rebellion in the most brutal and violent way. Louverture tells his followers, how are we going to fight this many French? We're not. The Maroons, as they were known, as he said, we're going to retreat to the mountains, and we're going to wait for the rainy season. And the French will die like flies, he wrote, because of mosquitoes. Well, little did he know, but not only the usual mosquitoes and diseases, but the yellow fever had gotten off the Henke. And it's estimated that 50,000 French soldiers died. And that, with all due respect to Louverture and the revolutionaries, that really helped to make the revolution a success, the first successful African uprising in the world on that. So the ship was pushed out of Saint Domingue, and it fled with passengers still carrying the mosquitoes, and it came to Philadelphia, the capital city at the time, the interim capital of the U.S. Now, there's a long history of pestilence shaping humanity. I made a list here from the bubonic plague, cholera, influenza, polio, smallpox, typhus, more recent ailments like AIDS, SARS, avian and swine flu, and now COVID-19, have fundamentally reshaped populations, movements, the state of medicine, social practices, our healthcare, and our politics. And a couple of the instances that the World Health Organization lists as among the most horrific in history. One of the earliest would be the plague of Athens in the year 430. It claimed, it's estimated, 1/3 of the population, including the father of democracy, Pericles. A year later, the Peloponnesian War would be impacted. It would come on the coattails of this horrific disease, which would change the complexion of the entire region. Of course, the loss of Pericles fundamentally, for the worse, harms the Athenian experiment in self-government. The Justinian plague, 541 in the Common Era, named for the emperor. It claimed it's estimated 1/5 of its capital city, which was Constantinople. 1/5, and nearly claimed the life of Justinian. And it fundamentally changed the empire, its politics, and so on. Of course, the Black Death, the plague. Many plagues throughout history, but this so bad, it was just known simply as the plague. 1346 is the main outbreak in Europe, estimated that it claimed 1/3 of Europe's population. Of course, people didn't know what brought it. They didn't know how, there were no known cures. Today, it's believed that it came on rats brought back from the spice trades, the Silk Road, and conquests in China, Mongolia, elsewhere, as well as North Africa. But because no one knew what caused it, the blame game and fear took hold. And tens of thousands of Jews were put to death, being blamed for the bubonic plague. But folks noticed was in many Jewish communities, the death toll was way less than 1/3, in part because folks had to live separate, the hygiene practice, eating kosher, and so forth and so on. Ergo, the conclusion was Jews caused the bubonic plague as part of this global plot to take over the world, which has been around for at least 2,000 years. Anyway, so those are some of the outbreaks that changed the world. Now the new world. We're all aware now with various scholarship and books being released in recent years, since I guess the post-Columbian era, with Columbus arriving in 1492, disease in North and South America and the West Indies has claimed far more native peoples than war, enslavement, or forced relocation. It's estimated that 90% of the indigenous people were wiped out by either European diseases like smallpox or things like yellow fever, which were brought from Africa, ironically, in slave ships. Of course, everybody knows about Cortez, the Aztecs. Just a few men conquered this great Aztec empire under Montezuma because of smallpox. You can see the images of there, just a gruesome disease, which the locals had no resistance for in the early 1500s, and to claim the life of the great leader Montezuma. Yellow fever outbreaks also throughout the region. One notorious one was on the Middle Passage. The slave ship, the Zong, Z-O-N-G, captained by a guy named Collingwood, in 1781 was sailing across the Atlantic. The sailors noticed an outbreak of what they believe was yellow fever in the deep holds of the boat. What the captain ordered was every enslaved individual be thrown overboard to their death. So just a horrific incident. When he arrives, he actually files a lawsuit to try to get refunded for the property he lost while at sea. So mindful of that. Yellow jack, yellow fever, Aedes aegypti, comes from that mosquito there. It's believed to be an ancient disease that it's believed to have originated in Egypt, thus the name, the unwelcomed Egyptian. And of course, not only originated in Egypt, but it spread throughout the world because of the age of sail, the slave trade, and of course, the welcoming hot, humid climates of the West Indies and South America. Yellow fever is a brutal malady, and the descriptions of it are difficult to read. I read countless ones in preparation for this talk and the book I wrote about it. It was known as yellow jack. That's what sailors called it, thus the logo down there. Ships fly different flags or jacks to mean different things. If they flew a yellow one, that meant yellow fever was on board, stay away. It attacks the red blood cells Symptoms include internal bleeding, black vomit, chills, headaches, numbness, soreness, dry and discolored tongue, urinary, kidney, and liver failure ultimately, and the skin and eyes turn a yellowish color, thus the name of the disease, yellow fever or yellow jack. It hit the Western Hemisphere. As you can see here, it's estimated that the earliest outbreaks, 1640s in Barbados and the Yucatan Peninsula of eastern Mexico. It struck the United States when it was a British colony. Charleston, New York City, and Virginia. There you can see the years in the 16 and 1700s. There were periodic outbreaks of the disease, but Philadelphia had not seen an outbreak in at least 3 decades, and most of America had not seen an outbreak since the one in Virginia. So people began to think they were clear of that strange disease that attacked everyone. Ben Franklin got a hold of the books, the notes from a doctor that treated patients during the Virginia outbreak in the 1700s. Ben Franklin would then go through that and note that we haven't had a yellow fever outbreak since then. He would then give those notes to a very, very famous physician named Benjamin Rush, who would be the first to ultimately identify the outbreak, rather, of 1793. So Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty, it was by far the most important city in the country, bigger than even Boston. And New York City, perhaps 50,000 people there in the summer of 1793. That July is when the Henke, with yellow fever on board, docked in Philadelphia with all the refugees from Haiti. Philadelphia was quite the city at the time. It was America's city, America's birthplace, site of the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, home to the great Dr. Ben Franklin. The city had the largest library in the country, the first circulating library, the first sanitation department, the first street lighting department. They would hang lanterns on these high posts, and men would walk on those circus stilts and light them. It had the American Philosophical Society, the first, I guess, academic or cerebral organization. It had a college, today Penn. It had a medical association, probably more doctors per capita than any place else in the country. Probably more doctors in Philadelphia than much of the rest of the country. So it was quite the city. It also had a bustling port and one of the most famous markets in the country, where everybody came to trade agricultural wares and other things. It was an ominous start to the year in 1793. There was a drought, and people talked about the smell, that the water levels in the rivers and creeks and streams were so low that dead fish were piling up on the banks, creating a horrific smell. Then they noticed that birds and cats were dying in massive numbers. Then birds were then fleeing the city. They documented, big flocks of birds flying out of the city. Even more ominous, there was a meteor shower, and a meteorite struck and landed right in the downtown of the city. So people began to get very fearful, panic, superstitious. So the city was already in the grips of fear and finger pointing in July of 1793 when the Henke docked. The first to die were here at the docks, the ports. The area along Water Street in Philadelphia, along the river, was known as Helltown. It was unruly. It had a Wild West feel to it. It was an area of slaves, sailors, vagrants, recent refugees, and of course, as most port cities were around the world at the time, it was defined by its lawlessness. The first cases that occur in late July and early August were found here in Helltown by the port at a place called Denny's Boarding House. Not surprisingly, because it was not only at the port, but it was a boarding house for sailors and refugees from abroad. And that's where people started to die. There was a Quaker woman named Elizabeth Drinker that kept a daily diary throughout this ordeal, which it survives today. It's a great resource. And she writes at this time period, her husband had a warehouse down at the waterfront. There has been an unusual number of funerals lately here. It is really an alarming and serious time. 'Tis a sickly time now. They would later say this was the sickly season. So people started to die in big numbers at the port. Not a big panic yet, however. because it was just sailors and refugees, enslaved individuals, and most folks didn't care about them. And the disease had not found its way into Philadelphia proper. Um, Enter Benjamin Rush. He's the father of American medicine, the most famous doctor in American history, with all due respect to Dr. Oz. um, Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration. He was a surgeon in George Washington's army during the war. Really celebrated. He has admirable traits and despicable traits. It's easy to love Rush and easy to hate Rush. I found myself in the latter camp, by the way. He was a moralist. Admirably, he was an abolitionist. He was a social reformer, advocating refraining from alcohol and tobacco. However, Benjamin Rush was a narcissist. He believed that God put him there to cure this disease. He believed that this disease was put there as a test for him. I mean, this is absurd. He was messianic. He was crusading in a good and bad way. The good way was that he was tireless and brave. He believed the disease was contagious. Yet every day he went into the Helltown area of the city where most doctors wouldn't go, and he would treat patients in the grips of the disease and then do autopsies on the dead. And he did it all day long, every day, weekends included. So he was brave and tireless, but he was thin-skinned and messianic insofar as if anyone questioned him, he accused them of being an enemy. He would soon call them unpatriotic, un-American, and if you questioned him, you wanted people to die. Unfortunately, Rush was so popular, and he would be a darling of the anti-Federalists. That would be the less government, usually Southern, more rural Jeffersonian party. Today, you might say the Republicans. He would be a darling of them. So this thing would immediately turn political with Rush leading the cause into the politics. Sadly, Jefferson followed suit. On August 3rd was when he first went to Helltown and starts to document all this. Finally, on August 19th, he announces the cause of the mysterious ailment killing people at the port, and that would be yellow fever. He used those notes that were given to him by Ben Franklin from the doctor in Virginia a few decades earlier that treated the last outbreak. Rush produces his guide for the disease, which was published in all the newspapers, distributed by the mayor, William Clarkson, for people. And that sounds like a great public health advent, but Rush's guide for the disease got everything wrong. He was wrong on the causes, he was wrong on the origins, he was wrong on the treatment. And because he was famous, because he was so arrogant, and because he had the backing of Jefferson, Madison, and Southern slave owners, he wasn't questioned. So we had the wrong treatment. Rush would even, he was very devout, very religious. He would even say that, there's not a disease that God hasn't put some remedy for it on earth. And he would go on to say, and I am part of that remedy, which is, arrogant. That's the mayor. The initial response in August was good, and things looked like it might be under control. The disease was still restrained or to just the Helltown, the port area. The mayor put a committee together. Clarkson was a remarkably enlightened and progressive fellow. They had subcommittees, one to distribute food because a lot of the workers in the fields were getting sick. They cleaned houses on orders from the mayor. People were told to wear masks. They were told to, by present day parlance, socially distance to avoid one another and walk on opposite sides of the streets. He banned large public gatherings, especially at sunset. That's when he noticed people got ill. Of course, that's when mosquitoes are active. People believe that gunpowder would ward away this. So there were fires all over the city and cannons being blasted. All it did was create and tar being burned, a tar black smog and stench over the city. So he outlawed those, saying they didn't work. People were ringing bells to invoke God and to scare away the demons. And he said that doesn't work. So he banned all that as well. He also created committees to bury the dead, and the bodies began to pile up. People were afraid to touch them and bury them. So by not burying them, they created other diseases. And orphans. He created a committee headed by a guy named Israel, I can't make that up, who was tireless in caring for dozens and dozens of orphans in the city. He also created a fever hospital. This is Bush Hill. They very enlightened. He asked this fellow here, Stephen Girard, who was a Frenchman with one eye, probably the wealthiest person in the city at the time, and Jean de Visay, who was a French doctor who had practiced in Haiti. And they said that they thought that if they could get out of the city, up on a hill, high ground, cooler environment, trees, that would be good for treating it. So they picked the right location. It was owned by a guy named Hamilton, not the one from the musical, and George Washington's cabinet, who was in England. So they confiscated and turned it into a hospital. And very enlightened, they treated people with love and care, hydrating them, trying to keep them comfortable. And they were making a little bit of headway here under Girard and Devise, who risked their own lives because they weren't sure yet if the disease was contagious. Finally, Devise would announce that it was not contagious, but Rush would counter him and say it is, don't question me, and then people believed it was, which it was not. They needed people to staff the hospital and enter these two Black preachers, Absalom Jones on the left and Richard Allen. These two would be later go on to found the first Black church in the country, the first Black newspaper in the country, and the first book in this nascent country written by someone of African descent. They would write it together. They would be the founders of the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and they're still celebrated in AME tradition today. They created the Free African Society, and for a few reasons, they got active and they staffed, former slaves staffed the Bush Hill Fever Hospital. One reason was they saw an opportunity to prove their worth and counter some of the discriminatory treatment. Another reason, they were just good folks, these two preachers, and they wanted to, as you can see from the quote here, they're the instruments in the hands of God to save lives. So the response starts off good August, but by September, full panic, chaos, and political divisions. It's a famous artist depiction of Stephen Girard, the head of the Bush Hospital. Even though he was the wealthiest person in the city, he goes around the city in carriages and picks up those dying, takes them to his hospital. Even when they thought it was contagious, he did this. So what happens is people start dying en masse. There's not enough people to bury the dead. The graveyards fill up. The evacuation starts. People are fleeing the city. Rush attacks any doctor as unpatriotic, un-American, that doesn't agree with him. Jefferson and Madison politicize this, and the Southern Anti-Federalists, the less government party, the States' Rights Party, they start to announce that any mandatory quarantine or masks or social distancing is against their freedoms, and they refuse to wear masks and follow any of the orders and even respect their neighbors. So things get ugly in September, and that's when it bottoms out. They called it the Physicians' War. The city's physicians are up in arms over four arguments: the cause, the original origin of the disease, the treatment, and contagion. Benjamin Rush weighs in and says it was caused by miasma, as you can see in the bottom. This comes from Hippocrates, the father of medicine. And at the time, Greek medicine and all the way through believed that most diseases were caused by two things: an imbalance in body fluids and bloods, or miasma, which is poisonous or dangerous gases in the air. Hippocrates, one of his many great contributions beside the oath, was the idea that he looked for causes of disease not from God, but from natural causes. So he's pseudo-scientific method, one might say. Look for that. But miasma was seen as the cause of most diseases. So Rush, who was reading ancient Greek manuscripts, Dr. Rush says it's caused by poison gases. What was the cause of it then? That's the origin. One of the ships that docked next to the Henke unloaded rotted coffee. And Rush said that rotted coffee caused the disease. So they cleaned up the coffee and then thought everything would be fine. The treatment, Rush felt that there was an imbalance in blood, phlegm, and body fluids. So the best way to treat it is through purging and bleeding. And when purging and bleeding did not work, it just weakened Rush's patience. He purged more and bled more to the point where he was probably killing more people than the disease at one point. Any doctor that questioned him, however, was attacked by anti-Federalist leaders, Jefferson, Madison, attacked by anti-Federalist newspapers, politicians, and by Benjamin Rush. So what were the causes and treatments? The public believed that tar and gunpowder, which didn't do anything except pollute the city, and the mayor ordered that ended. A lot of people refused to listen to the mayor's decree and continued to burn things, saying it was their freedom. Rush's bleeding and purging. Moreover, his purging, he used calomel. He used a poisonous Mexican root and mercury. He was poisoning and killing people. And that was such a violent purge, diarrhea and vomiting, that it caused lesions in both orifices and was weakening people. But he did more and more and more of it. You can see Dr. Devisi, who was the opponent to Rush, who was the French doctor from present-day Haiti, who was treating patients at Bush Hill Fever Hospital. He said Rush is a scourge worse than the plague itself. But then Rush banishes Devisi, basically. Enter the fray Alexander Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton could never keep his mouth shut. And he and Jefferson get into it once again. Jefferson's backing Rush, who was an advocate of his own political party, this anti-federalist faction. Hamilton backs a Dr. Stevens, who came from the same island in the West Indies as Hamilton did. Hamilton was in Nevis and St. Croix in the West Indies. And Stevens and Hamilton advocate, get this, bathing, hygiene, inhaling herbs. To hydrate, they recommended wine and lemonade, and to avoid bleeding and purging. Pretty enlightened. Of course, Jefferson then attacks Hamilton, as you're not a physician. Rush attacks Hamilton viciously, and the anti-federalist newspapers attack Hamilton. Hamilton attacks back, but then Hamilton contracts yellow fever, as does his wife, Eliza from the musical. They contracted. They're worried about them, and Hamilton's worried about his wife and children. So they go back to upstate New York to flee from the disease. Jefferson and Madison chastise, and other anti-federalists chastise Hamilton for fleeing. What did Jefferson, Madison, and the anti-federalists do? They fled. But never mind what I do, just listen to what I say. So they hypocritically criticized Hamilton for that. They blamed Hamilton for contracting it. And quite frankly, their language is very snarky, almost as if they enjoyed the fact that Hamilton nearly died. So this is the state of things. You can see the hardening of the political divisions and the finger pointing. The two factions start to merge into political parties, and one of the key factors in the creation of the Federalist Party and the anti-Federalists, known as the Jefferson Republicans or the Democratic Republicans, is this disease. People refuse to wear masks of that political ilk. They refuse to socially distance. They're told to not have large events. Preachers and conservative leaders call for large events at sunset in blatant defiance of it. Of course, many of them die from the disease. Vigilante squads pop up in cities around the country. Anyone from Philadelphia trying to get there, the vigilante squads were attacking them. Cities put up quarantine centers for anybody traveling from elsewhere. Panic and fear run up and down the eastern seaboard. And inevitably, the same folks behind all that start to blame blacks, blame Jews, and blame immigrants for the disease. So the city, the capital, and the East Coast is in the grips of this xenophobic, anti-immigrant, bigoted kind of fear-mongering. The preachers don't help things by claiming that it's God's wrath, that Philadelphia was so sinful. God is purging sinners. One preacher, Justice Christian Helmet, he announces that sword, famine, and pestilence are the servants of the Lord, whom he sends or retains at his pleasure. So the city's preachers claim that it's retribution. Why? Because Philadelphia is sinful. They point, in addition to blacks, Jews, and immigrants, they point at the theater. Philadelphia had the largest theater in the country, and they brought over 70 actors from Europe, and they were hosting large theater productions. The preachers and the conservatives in that party start to call the theater the synagogue of Satan. So anti-Semitic, bigoted, fear-mongering, and they demand that the theater be shut down. To Mayor Clarkson's credit, he doesn't shut the theater down. So the evacuation occurs in September, the mass exodus from the city. Almost half the population flees the city. You can see that perhaps up to 20,000 people fled. I believe it might have been more because records were sparse at the time. Because high profile people like Hamilton and his wife contracted it, everybody's panicking. The Hamiltons fled. John Todd and his child die. That was the person who would become Dolly Madison. That was her first husband. She was Dolly Todd. She loses her son and her husband. She would later marry Madison. Samuel Powell, who was America's mayor, not Rudy Giuliani, but Samuel Powell, was the great revolutionary mayor and leading politician in the city. He refuses to abandon his beloved city to show strength for the public, and he dies. Benjamin Rush contracts it and nearly dies. On September 10th, George Washington does the unthinkable. He orders that the federal government shut down, and he abandons the city. He was begged to leave the city by none other than former Mayor Samuel Powell's wife, Eliza Willing Powell. Washington, you have to live. If Washington dies, where are we? So Washington shuts the government down. We go this duration, September, October, without the federal government. People fled so quickly that they didn't know where one another were. Members of Congress, generals, the Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of War were spread out across the country. So Washington leaves, goes back to Mount Vernon, leaves Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, in charge. Henry Knox is arrested and put into a quarantine. So we have no government functioning. Hamilton, Jefferson, the sequel, not only are they fighting over treatment and causes, but they're fighting over evacuation. Jefferson says they shouldn't evacuate, but of course he evacuates, as does his party. They criticize Hamilton for leaving. But they're also fighting over when the government should return to Philadelphia. George Washington wants the government to return as soon as possible. We're vulnerable. However, they get into a huge constitutional fight. Basically Southerners, the Jefferson, the Anti-Federalist group say the Constitution does not allow us to meet, and they're obstructing the meeting. Washington finally has enough of it and asked Hamilton for a solution. And Hamilton and Washington decide if there's an emergency, we can convene Congress elsewhere. So they meet in Germantown. Why? October 31st, no new cases of yellow fever at Bush Hill, so they fly the white flag. There's the home Washington met in with the cabinet. And then on November 11th, as everybody's debating and Jefferson and Madison are saying you can't go back into the city, Washington on a Sunday gets on a horse and rides to the city himself to prove it's okay. The frost killed the mosquitoes. On December 2nd, Congress arrives and we endure. So what's the legacy of this outbreak? Political parties formed. Philadelphia would create the first public waterworks in the country, public health standards, hygiene. The debate over should the capital stay in Philadelphia? Now the answer is no, move it to the shores of the Potomac. The population shift, people start to move out of the cities into more rural areas. This is one of the first arguments to end the Atlantic slave trade because they realized the slave trade was bringing diseases, and at least 10% of the capital city died. Extrapolate that to today. Yellow fever was finally cured. 1898, the Spanish-American War, tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers either died or were too ill to fight. It allowed us to win. We lost more men in that war from the disease, yellow fever, than from combat. A third of Havana's population had died. Dr. Carlos Finley suggested that it was mosquito-borne on yellow fever. And there at the bottom of the screen, that's Dr. Walter Reed, who conducted experiments. They even infected themselves. One of his colleagues died. Reed lived and identified yellow fever. The petite man at the top of the screen, he develops a vaccine in 1937 and wins the Nobel Prize. So we licked yellow fever. Yet you can see hundreds of thousands of infections every year and 30,000 people a year die. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you.